Arizona Territory, 1884. The sun was barely up when Abigail Renshaw was dragged through the dust of Bisbee's Main Street, her shawl slipping from her shoulders and her cheeks burning hotter than the mid-July heat. "Go on, then," a woman shouted from the boardwalk outside the general store. "Take your shame with you." The laughter was sharp and loud, echoing off adobe walls and wooden saloons. Abigail kept walking. She held her chin high, but her hands trembled as she clutched her satchel. It was all she had left, that and the 2 sets of tiny footprints trailing behind her. "Come on, Mama," said Clara, her 9-year-old daughter, wide-eyed and quiet. Caleb, barely 5, gripped Abigail's skirt in silence, his other hand dragging a wooden horse carved by someone who was long gone. They had no wagon, no horse, and no home anymore. It had taken less than a month for the truth to come out. That her late husband, Charles Renshaw, had forged signatures and stolen land deeds. That he had been married before Still was, to a woman in Kansas. When the sheriff brought it to light, Abigail had stood in the middle of the church with her children and watched every friend she had turned their back on her. The preacher's wife had whispered, "Whore," loud enough for all to hear. No one cared that she had not known. No one cared that she had been left with nothing. The last person to speak to her kindly was the stable boy who gave Clara an apple. But someone else had seen. Nathaniel Boone sat on his horse just outside the blacksmith shop, arms resting on the saddle horn. He had come into town for nails and a new bridle, same as he did every other week. He was lean, dust-covered, and quiet, with a rifle strapped behind his saddle and a sun-worn hat pulled low on his brow. He had watched the whole scene unfold. He had not laughed, and he had not looked away. Later, when the sun was high and Abigail sat beneath the cottonwood tree just beyond the edge of town, trying to keep Caleb from crying and Clara from asking where they were going next, she heard hooves. "Ma'am," came a voice. Smooth, low, careful. She looked up, shielding her eyes. Nathaniel Boone dismounted and removed his hat. "I am not asking for anything," Abigail said quickly. "I do not need pity." "I did not offer any," he replied, setting his hat against his thigh. "Just thought you might want water for the children." He handed her a canteen. She took it, hesitated, then gave it to Clara. The girl drank without thanks, but her eyes softened. "I got a place out west a ways, not fancy, but it is dry and quiet and the roof stays up in the wind." He looked at her steadily. "You and the little ones could rest there. Just for a while." Abigail's hands tightened on her skirt. "You do not know me, I saw enough," he said. "And I know what it is to be alone." She studied him. He was not smiling, not trying to charm her. He just stood there, waiting. Abigail looked at Clara, then at Caleb, who had crawled into her lap. She exhaled. "Just for a while," she said. Nathaniel nodded once, then helped her lift the children onto his horse while he walked beside it. They traveled together for 3 hours. Through dry brush, past cacti reaching like arms into the sky, and into a narrow canyon where a one-room cabin sat nestled between red rock and cottonwood trees. There was a small corral, a lean-to, and chickens scratching in the dust. Inside, it was cool and clean. There were 2 quilts on the bed and a pot of stew still warm on the stove. Nathaniel set down their things and turned to her. "You can have the bed. I will sleep in the barn." "You do not have to, I do," he said, and that was the end of it. For the next week, Abigail barely spoke. She cleaned the cabin, helped Clara wash the clothes, and tried to keep Caleb from pulling feathers off the hens. Nathaniel came and went, hauling wood, checking traps, tending to his horse. He never asked questions. He never stared. But he always brought back something for the children: an apple, a carved whistle, a bag of marbles. One night while the children slept, Abigail stepped out onto the front porch where Nathaniel was sharpening a knife. "I cannot stay here forever," she said. He looked up. I know, but I do not know where else to go. He set the blade down and leaned back. You ever worked with horses? She shook her head. Then I will teach you. You can help me. That way you earn your keep and no one can say I gave you charity. Her eyes filled before she could stop them. She turned her face away, but he saw. I am sorry, she said. You do not need to be. The next morning he taught her to saddle his mare. Her hands shook, but he stayed patient. When she got it right, he nodded. You got good hands, he said. Abigail flushed. I used to bake bread. He smiled just once and it stayed with her all day. Weeks passed. Abigail smiled more. Clara laughed again. Caleb started calling Nathaniel Mr. Boone, then just Nate. One evening, while Clara and Caleb were chasing fireflies near the creek, Abigail handed him a cup of coffee. Thank you, she said. For what? For not asking questions. Nate looked at her. You do not owe me anything, Abigail, she swallowed. Maybe not, but I want to give you something. He looked at the children, then back at her, gentle but firm. You do not have to, I know, she said, but I want to stay if you will let me. His jaw tightened. I will. Then, quiet. I want you to. The next morning she kissed him when she handed him bread. He kissed her back, and that night she slept in the bed, curled beside him, her head on his chest. Nobody knew. Nobody laughed. But word got back to Bisbee that the woman who had been run out with nothing now lived with a cowboy, that she had no shame, that she wore no ring, and Abigail heard it. At the trading post, whispered behind her back. 2 days later, Nate walked into town. He found the preacher. He bought a ring. He stood in the middle of the same street where she had been thrown out, and then he called her name. Abigail Renshaw. She stepped out of the store, holding Clara's hand. Nate dropped to one knee, right there in the dust. You are the bravest woman I ever met. You are better than this town deserves, and you are already mine, but I want the world to know it. He held up the ring. She gasped, hand over her mouth. Marry me, right now. Let them look, let them see. Tears fell down her cheeks. She nodded once. A small crowd gathered. People stared. Some whispered. But when Nate took her hand and slipped the ring on her finger, she smiled through her tears. And when the preacher came out and said the words, and Nate kissed her in the middle of the dirt road where she had once been shamed, nobody laughed. Nobody dared. She was his wife now. And he was hers. The night they wed, Nathaniel carried Abigail across the threshold, not as show, but because her legs weren't steady. The weight of the day, what it asked, what it gave, had settled in her bones like a storm finally spent. She didn't speak, only laid her head against his shoulder, her hand resting over his heart. Inside, Clara was helping Caleb out of his boots, both pretending not to watch. Nathaniel set Abigail down gently, then crouched in front of the children. Your ma and I made it right today, he said, voice low but firm. That makes us family proper now. Clara blinked, then looked at Abigail. So we stay here? Abigail nodded once. Yes, sweetheart. We stay. Caleb climbed into Nathaniel's lap without hesitation, small arms wrapping around his neck. Do you know how to fish? Nathaniel's mouth twitched. I do. Will you show me tomorrow? That night, after the children were asleep and the lantern turned down low, Abigail sat at the edge of the bed, unlacing her boots. Nathaniel knelt to help, fingers gentle at her ankles. I don't need you to, I know, he said. But I want to. She looked down at him then, her voice quiet. I forgot what kindness felt like, real kindness, the kind that doesn't wait for something in return. He stood and met her gaze. Then we remember it together. Their first morning as husband and wife began with the sound of chickens and the scent of sagebrush warming in the sun. Abigail found an apron tucked behind the door, an old one, patched but clean, and tied it around her waist without thinking. Nathaniel had already gone out to split wood, and Clara was helping Caleb button his shirt. By midday, Nathaniel returned with a brace of rabbits and his hat dusted in pine needles. He handed the rabbits to Clara, who took them with a nod and carried them behind the cabin like she'd seen her mother do 100 times before. Abigail wiped her hands on her apron. "You've got pitch on your shirt." He looked down. "Tree didn't like being trimmed. You've got a basin by the barn." She fetched water and scrubbed the fabric herself, despite his protests. As she worked, she asked, "You chop trees out here often?" "Only when they start leaning where they shouldn't." This one was getting too bold near the corral. She smiled without meaning to. "Sounds like you." He leaned against the post. "And how's that? Careful. But you don't let things push in where they don't belong." He considered that, then nodded once. "Fair." Later they sat beneath the cottonwood behind the cabin, Caleb asleep beside them with a crust of bread in his hand, Clara drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. Abigail leaned back against the tree, eyes half closed. "You ever think about leaving Arizona?" she asked, not looking at him. Nathaniel took his time answering. "Once or twice, but it's quiet here. Wild, sure, but honest." She nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "Kansas wasn't honest, not for me." He turned to her. "You ever want to go back?" "No." She opened her eyes. "There's nothing left there with my name on it." He reached over and took her hand, his thumb rough and warm against her knuckles. "There's something here now." She didn't reply, just curled her fingers around his. That evening, Nathaniel laid out boards on the floor of the cabin, sketching with charcoal. Clara peered over his shoulder. "What's that?" "New walls," he said. "You and your brother need your own space before long." Abigail looked up from the hearth. "You mean to build on?" "I mean to make room." She set down the spoon. "That'll be a lot of work. I've done worse for less." He saw the way her breath caught not from fear but from the weight of being chosen. Weeks passed and the heat gave way to something gentler. The wind shifted. The days shortened. Nathaniel taught Clara how to hold a rifle, steady and sure, while Caleb followed behind with a stick, pretending to scout trails. Abigail began tending a patch of earth behind the cabin, coaxing beans and squash from the soil with more hope than certainty. One afternoon, as clouds gathered low over the hills, Nathaniel came in early, boots wet from creek mud. "Storm's coming," he said. "Strong one, maybe." Abigail went to the window. "How bad?" "Bad enough to tie the animals down and latch the roof tight." She pulled on her shawl. "I'll help." They worked side by side, tying the shutters, checking the barn latches, blanketing the mare. Abigail's hands were red with cold by the time they returned inside, and Nathaniel wrapped them in his without a word. That night, wind rattled the walls, but the fire held steady and the cabin stayed warm. Caleb curled in Abigail's lap. Clara leaned against Nathaniel's side. And when the wind howled loudest, Abigail looked at the man beside her, the man who had taken her shame and laid it to rest without ever asking her to forget it. She reached for his hand. He held it, and neither of them let go. The rains came hard that spring, turning the red earth to clay and slowing the days into a quieter rhythm. The creek swelled and flattened again, leaving behind driftwood and the scent of wet mesquite. Abigail stood at the edge of the garden one morning, her skirts heavy with dew, staring down at the neat rows where fresh shoots had begun to push through. It had taken weeks of coaxing, but something was growing. Behind her, the cabin door creaked open. Nathaniel stepped out, rolling down his sleeves. "You planted early," he said. "I didn't want to wait," she replied. He stepped beside her, rubbing the back of his neck. "Might be a good season." Abigail brushed a bit of soil from her palm. "If the rabbits stay out of it." He glanced at the fence. "I'll run wire this afternoon. Keep them from slipping through." She nodded. "That'd help." They stood there a while, watching the wind move through the cottonwoods. Then Clara's voice rose from behind the cabin. "There's a wagon coming." Nathaniel turned first. Dust swirled beyond the bend, rising behind a pair of mules. He narrowed his eyes. Too early for trading folk. Abigail crossed her arms, her mouth tightening. "It's not someone from town, is it?" "Doubt it," he said, already stepping off the porch. The wagon rolled slow, creaking under its own weight. The driver was a man with a bandage around his wrist and a limp in one leg. In the bed behind him, a younger woman sat beneath a tattered parasol, holding a child to her chest. They looked worn out but not dangerous. Nathaniel raised a hand. "You lost." The man nodded once. "Came out from Fort Bowie. Wheel cracked 2 miles back. We're headed north but can't go much farther without a smith." Abigail stepped forward. "You've got a child." The woman looked up, eyes hollow. "He's burning up." Without waiting, Abigail turned toward the cabin. "Bring him inside." Nathaniel helped the man unhitch the mules while Abigail boiled water and laid the boy on the quilted bed. The child's skin was flushed and damp, his breathing shallow. The mother hovered near the door, uncertain, until Abigail brought her a cup of broth. "You're safe here," she said. The woman blinked like she hadn't heard those words in a long time. "We were turned away twice before we got this far." Abigail didn't ask why. She only said, "He'll need willow bark. There's some hanging near the stove." By dusk, the boy's fever had broken. Nathaniel mended the wheel with fresh spokes from the barn, and the father, whose name was Elias, offered to trade a tin of coffee and a small sack of cornmeal for their trouble. "Keep it," Nathaniel said. "You'll need it more than we will." Elias hesitated. "Not many would have stopped for us." Nathaniel looked past him, toward Abigail kneeling beside the boy. "She would have." They left the next morning, the woman pressing Abigail's hand before climbing into the wagon. Clara waved until they disappeared down the trail. Later, while Caleb napped and the fire crackled low, Abigail sat at the table stitching a tear in Nathaniel's shirt. He was carving a handle for a new hoe, his knife slow and steady. "That boy reminded me of Caleb," she said. "Same cough, same way he clings when he's scared." Nathaniel looked up. "You did right letting them in." "I didn't think twice." "I know." She set the shirt aside. "It's strange. I used to worry what people said about me. Now I worry whether there's enough bark left for the next sick child." He didn't smile, but something in his gaze softened. "You've changed." "I had to." "No," he said. "You just stopped hiding." The quiet stretched between them, comfortable and full. Then she said, "I want to build a root cellar so we can keep things through winter. I'll start digging in the morning." She reached for his hand, calloused and warm. "I've never had someone who just said yes. You've got one now." That night, thunder rolled far off in the hills, but the sky remained clear. Abigail lay beside Nathaniel, her fingers tracing the line of his collarbone. He caught her hand, kissed the tips of her fingers, and pulled her close until her breathing steadied against his chest. Outside, coyotes called in the distance, but the cabin stayed still, wrapped in warmth and wood smoke. And inside it, love took root where shame had once tried to live. The sun hadn't yet cleared the ridge the morning Nathaniel found the first deep crack along the west wall of the springhouse. He crouched beside it, running his hand along the cool stone, then stood and stepped back, studying the way the mortar had shifted. Abigail came out with a wrapped heel of bread and saw him standing there, quiet and still. "What's wrong with it?" she asked, handing him the bundle. He took it absently. "Masonry's pulling apart, ground settling uneven." She narrowed her eyes at the uneven base. "We can't leave it to crumble. That's where the butter keeps. I'll shore it up. Might take a few days." He turned the bread in his hand. "You ever worked with lime?" She gave a dry laugh. "I've worked with worse." By noon, she was hauling buckets from the creek while Nathaniel lifted stones from the dry edge of the arroyo. Clara helped where she could, but stayed mostly with Caleb, who had a cough that hadn't quite left him since the last cold night. Abigail checked on him between trips, laying her hand against his back, counting the spaces between breaths. That evening, when the mortar had dried just enough to hold its shape, Nathaniel leaned against the doorframe and watched her rub the ache from her arms. "You don't complain much," he said. "I used to," she said, brushing dust from her skirt. "Didn't get me far." He set down his gloves. "You keep pushing even when you don't have to." She looked at him, her voice low. "You gave me the chance to. That's not small." He stepped closer, the scent of earth and lime still clinging to his shirt. "You gave yourself more than I ever could." That night, after the children were asleep, Abigail opened the small tin where she kept her sewing needles and pulled out a folded strip of muslin. She handed it to Nathaniel without a word. He opened it slowly. Inside was a hand-stitched square, rough-edged but careful white thread forming the shape of a blooming cactus flower. "I made it when we first came," she said. "Didn't know where we'd land, but I wanted to mark it somehow, that we were still here." He traced the threads with one finger. "You stitched it by hand," she nodded. "When the children were asleep, I didn't have much else." He looked at her then like she'd handed him something rare. "I'll build a frame for it, hang it where it catches light." She smiled, the quiet kind that stayed. The next morning, Nathaniel saddled the bay mare for a ride out to the high ridge, where the fence line needed mending. Abigail packed a strip of smoked meat and 2 boiled eggs into a cloth and handed it to him. He lingered, brushing a thumb along her jaw. "If the cough gets worse, boil pine needles. Helps clear the lungs." "I will." He looked down at the children playing with stones in the dust. "I won't stay past sundown." She watched him ride out until he disappeared beyond the mesquite. That afternoon, Clara brought her a small bundle of wild onions, dirt still clinging to their roots. "I found them near the creek," she said. "Can we put them in supper?" Abigail bent to inspect them. "You've got a good eye." "I like doing things that help." Abigail brushed the girl's hair back. "Then you're already doing more than most." They cooked outside that evening, the air thick with the smell of onion and wood smoke. Caleb's cough had eased by then, and he fell asleep leaning against his sister's side. Abigail wrapped him in a woven blanket and carried him inside just as the last light disappeared from the sky. Nathaniel came home after dark, his boots heavy with dust, a fresh scrape on his forearm. Abigail met him at the door with a lantern in hand. "Fence hold?" she asked. "For now," he said. "But a storm comes through, we might have to start fresh." She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. "There's stew left." He washed at the basin, then sat and ate in silence while she patched a torn hem. Afterward, he pulled the muslin square from his pocket and held it out. "Thought about this all day," he said. "You stitched something that grows in dry ground. That's no small thing." "I didn't know what else would fit." "It fits," he said. "Better than you know." That night, they lay beneath the quilt she had mended 3 times now, and she turned to face him in the dark. "I used to think love had to be loud, that it needed grand words and big promises." He brushed back her hair. "What do you think now?" "I think it's in the way you always come back." He kissed her forehead slow. "I'm not going anywhere," and she believed him. With every breath, every silence they shared, she believed him. By midsummer, the cottonwoods cast long shadows across the garden rows, and the beans had begun to climb the trellis Nathaniel built from stripped juniper. Abigail moved slower in the heat, her belly rounding beneath her apron. She never said the word aloud, but the children had noticed. Clara brought her water before she asked. Caleb pressed his ear against her side and whispered guesses about what the baby might look like. Nathaniel didn't speak of it much either. But he rose earlier now, worked later, and took greater care with the fence lines and the cabin roof. One afternoon, he came in with his shirt soaked through and a new cut along his thumb. Abigail took his hand without asking and wrapped it in clean cloth. "You've been in the sun since dawn," she said. "I wanted to finish the last gate. If I wait, it'll be one more thing come winter." She poured cool water over his wrist. "You're building like someone's about to arrive." He met her eyes without flinching. "Someone is." The baby came early in October, after an evening of hard wind and a night where the fire never quite reached the corners of the room. Abigail labored quietly, sweat beading at her temples, her jaw set against the pane. Clara stayed near, fetching towels and boiling water while Nathaniel worked at her side, his hands steady even when his voice caught. The moment broke just before dawn, when the newborn let out a thin, gasping cry. A girl, small and red-faced, her fists curled tight. Abigail held her close, her voice hoarse. She waited for the wind to pass. Nathaniel touched the child's head, his hand shaking for the first time. "She's strong already." They named her Ruth after Abigail's grandmother, whose name had been stitched into a quilt long since worn thin. Ruth slept in a cradle Nathaniel carved from pine, lined with a wool shawl Clara had outgrown. That winter, the cabin filled with quiet moments that lingered, Ruth's soft breathing at dawn, Caleb's whispered stories beneath the quilts, Clara's voice humming while she stirred the cornmeal. Nathaniel made a rocking chair from spare cedar, and Abigail sat in it each evening, Ruth in her arms, watching the fire settle into coals. One evening, while Ruth slept and the children built small figures from scraps of wood, Nathaniel set a folded piece of paper on the table. Abigail looked up from her stitching. "What's that?" "Deed transfer," he said. "Filed it in town 2 weeks back." She set the thread down. "For what?" "For the land. Half of it's yours now by law." She stared at the paper. "You didn't need to do that." "I know," he said. "But I wanted you to have more than my name. I wanted you to have ground beneath your feet that no one can take." She rose and crossed the room, laying her hand against his cheek. "You gave me that the day you opened your door." He turned his face into her palm. "I gave you shelter. You made it home." By the time Ruth could sit up, the garden had been turned again, blanketed in straw for the coming spring. Caleb had grown long-limbed and curious, always asking why the sun moved slower in winter and whether trees remembered names. Clara spent her time with a tattered book of plant drawings, copying them in charcoal on scraps of paper Nathaniel saved from flour sacks. One afternoon, Abigail stood on the porch, Ruth balanced on her hip, watching Nathaniel mend the corral gate. The sky was wide and pale, the wind soft enough to carry the smell of juniper. She stepped down onto the path and walked to him. He looked up, brushing sawdust from his trousers. "She let you put her down, only for the promise of bread." He smiled, slow and sure, then nodded toward the hill behind the barn. "I was thinking we could build another room come spring, for when she's bigger." Abigail tilted her head. "You planning far ahead?" "I want to give her room to grow." She reached for his hand. "Then let's build it together." He pulled her close, one arm around her waist, the other pressing her hand to his chest. "I don't want anything else but this." She looked up at him, eyes steady. "You have it." They stood there a while, the wind stirring the tall grass, Ruth babbling softly from the porch. That night they sat by the fire, the children asleep, Ruth nestled in her cradle. Abigail rested her head against Nathaniel's shoulder, her fingers entwined with his. "I used to think peace was something you had to find," she whispered. He shifted, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Sometimes it finds you." And in that cabin, lit by firelight and filled with the quiet breath of those they loved, they knew they had arrived at something lasting. A life shaped by choice, not chance. Built not from what they'd lost, but from what they had dared to begin again. They never left that place. They grew old as the trees did slowly, rooted deep, weathering wind and drought and time itself. And in every season, they loved each other more than the one before.